Good evening, everybody. In the interest of full disclosure, I don't have that kind of presentation. It's going to be very hard to follow up on that. I'm going to talk about a global agenda. An agenda, I think, that has motivated all of you in this room, and there are a surprisingly large number of you. I wasn't expecting quite this large a crowd, frankly. An agenda, I think, of sustainability and responsibility that is much farther along than we had all suspected as recently as September 2015. Now, it's sort of difficult to put this into the right kind of context, this global agenda for sustainable development that we're talking about, because it's been in the back of our minds, I think, for quite some time. I mean, we've all known that we can't focus on any one aspect of development. We can't just be thinking about the economics of it all, because somehow that doesn't generate the kind of results we would be looking for, because we don't deal with some of the environmental consequences of the kinds of production that we do and the kinds of consumption that we do. We all recognize that the social outcomes haven't been very satisfactory. There's a widening amount of inequality in the world, and we see that that is starting to threaten the very assumptions upon which our economic and social order is based. And yet we see that a couple of days ago in China, the heads of state of the G20 countries got together and came up with a communique that actually addresses a lot of this feeling of, well, not quite completeness that we're talking about. They didn't address it in a way that is entirely satisfactory, I would say, but we can see progress happening, and visible progress happening, in a way that would have been inconceivable as short as 5 years ago. I'm going to focus in on the question of green finance and sustainable development, in large part because I find that to be the most interesting part of my job. I'm sitting here looking at Nick, who understands what I'm talking about. But when we look at what the G20 communique said, and I'm summarizing it, and I think we'll be able to delve into that in a little bit more detail in the course of the next 2 days, they said that they take note of the progress that's been made in green finance. They encourage further work, boiling it down to that. And I take that as a confirmation of the fact that the global community now has moved beyond the debate around what's wrong. I think we've understood what is wrong, and we've decided that what we need is an integrated approach, an approach that brings together the key dimensions of economic sustainability and environmental sustainability and social sustainability into an integrated package. And that having already decided that this is the approach we want to take, we've moved now into implementation mode. And it is in this area of implementation that the global business and financial world comes into its own. What are we implementing? Well, we're implementing this global sustainable development agenda. At its most basic, it is an agenda that is aimed at fundamentally transforming the way we produce and the way we consume. It boils down to that. It's first and foremost a global agenda, one that is truly universal. It affects all countries, all peoples, all the time. And there's never been a global agenda anywhere like that. And because it is so universal and because it is so global, it requires the engagement of all stakeholders. And this in itself is a challenge. Now, over the course of the last year, maybe 2 years, as we've been thinking about what this sustainable development agenda should be, two things have become entirely clear. One, it is a vast agenda. It is essentially transforming the way society is put together. And that means it is beyond the capacity of any government individually or any set of governments collectively to implement. They cannot do it alone. It needs the engagement of all stakeholders. And as I said, that in itself is a challenge. The second recognition is that as vast as the agenda is, even vaster is its cost. And there isn't that much public money in the world. Now, I think all of you here from the private sector, you knew this. Happily, the money is there. The money is out there. There is enough money in the world, in the private sector, to make this global agenda a reality. The issue is, how do we mobilize this money into the kinds of investments that we need to transform the world the way we want to see it transformed? Now, I'm not an investor. I represent the United Nations, and it's often been criticized in the past for not understanding the private sector, not understanding the world of private capital. But this too is changing. We find that public policy and private enterprise are actually starting to converge. The private sector is looking increasingly at the implications of this global agenda. What does it mean for private business? What does it mean for private finance? And the public policy community is starting to come to terms with the simple fact that it is no longer about what governments decide. It is about the increasingly important role that the private sector and private finance in particular are going to have to play if we have any chance of realizing this agenda. Now, we are making progress. There's a tremendous amount of activity and innovation going on in the public policy space, and the G20 communique is just an indication of that. In fact, when we look back on 2015, we've started to call it the year of sustainability. Not only did the global community adopt the Sustainable Development Goals and the overall agenda, but we had the Sendai Framework of Disaster Risk Reduction in March of that year, which is a major undertaking. We had the Paris Agreement, the landmark Paris Agreement on climate change. Next month, in Quito, Ecuador, we have the Habitat 3 conference, where we expect global leaders to come together to deliver a new urban agenda, a way in which we can address the critically important and really large challenge of managing the rapid urbanization that is happening underneath us. And this is critical because all of this is going to contribute to the transformation of the way our societies are put together, the way we produce, the way we consume, the transformation of everything and putting it all onto a sustainable footing. Now, we in UNEP, we like to call that the green transition as a sort of a shorthand for it all. But what we find is that there has been a momentum created by these global agreements, and this momentum is spilling over now into the financial world. In just the last year, we've seen the launch of the G20 Green Finance Study Group. We've seen the Financial Stability Board's Task Force on Climate Change-related risks, and elements of these initiatives were featured in the G20 communique yesterday. And when you think about the time frame that we're talking about, 7 or 8 months for the G20, you see how rapidly this momentum is spilling back over into the public policy space. These global policy initiatives are reflecting the importance that global policymakers are attaching to the whole issue of sustainable development and their increasing recognition that green finance is an essential part of the formula for success. But the investment world itself must also rise to the challenge, because if it fails to do so, it'll find itself on the wrong end of history. It'll also find itself on the wrong end of long-term markets. And that, in fact, is, to my mind, the point of all this discussion that we've been undertaking about integrating economic and environmental and social and governance issues into the business models and into the mainstream practice of private business and finance. This is the new financial reality that we face. It's not a passing fad. It's one of the new realities of the 21st century that Chris was talking about, albeit in a far more gripping way than I can. Environmental and social objectives cannot and should not be add-ons that are considered after the profits of the quarter have been secured. True economic sustainability cannot be achieved without environmental sustainability or social sustainability. That means that these have to be an intrinsic part of the business model. It's still about profit, but it's about profit that you can sustain over time. It's the thick profit you just referred to, Chris. Now, I don't want to give the impression that we're just starting out. In fact, far from it. Over the past couple of years, UNEP has been conducting what we call an inquiry into the design of a sustainable financial system. Nick Robbins here is the co-director of that inquiry. And what it has found is that there's a quiet revolution, as we call it, that's taking place in the financial world. The policymakers, the financial actors, have started to take action of different kinds in different places, in different areas, that have created a momentum for change in financial markets. The momentum has 3 basic building blocks. On the one hand, you have market leadership, the innovative change that the visionary people are putting in place. We have the policy experiments, regulatory changes that are being put in place to see how one can nudge the financial system into a different direction. And we have international cooperation trying to adapt the architecture, the rules of the game that govern market behavior. Now, these building blocks are being combined in different ways in different countries to respond to different priorities and different imperatives. In some countries, the momentum has come from bottom-up approaches. You have the private sector, you have private business, private financial actors coming together to say that they want to do things in a different way, and they create innovations in the market which then lead the regulators, the public hand, to make adaptations themselves, to clarify the market rules and to level the playing field. In other places, the approach has been more top-down, led by policy, led by regulatory reform, and these actions have sometimes, often, been motivated by broader principles of national priorities. So, for example, you will see interventions by the Central Bank of Bangladesh in an effort to guide credit practices in a particular direction. We have other examples as well. We have the Green Finance Task Force that China set up, and we see a whole string of policy developments that have resulted from the work of that task force. We have the roadmap that the Indonesian financial regulator has put forward, a roadmap for sustainable finance, intended to shift the way in which the entire financial sector works. Now, these policy initiatives at the national level, they've emerged from different places where the opportunities for change have been identified, sometimes in collaboration with the private sector, sometimes independently of it. The range of measures that we've seen and the range of actors involved in these measures has been quite impressive. In fact, all of you here in this room have already begun gearing up for this kind of change. The momentum that we see among stock markets and pension funds and institutional investors, bond markets, regulators, and policymakers, it's truly impressive. Many of the changes that we see at the individual level are derived from, accompany initiatives at the global or the regional level, initiatives like the Sustainable Banking Network, the principles of sustainable insurance, the Equator principles, and of course the principles of responsible investment that motivates all of you here today. What we can draw from this is the expectation of a greater convergence between the ideas and the motivations of responsible investment on the one hand and sustainable development on the other hand, to the point where we will no longer have to speak about responsible investment because all investment will ultimately be responsible. And I think that's the aim of all of us here in this room. And yet, we have to say, despite all the momentum, despite everything that's going on, the quiet revolution is still a little bit too quiet. There's a lot going on, but I think many of us aren't fully aware of what is going on everywhere in the financial sector, or everywhere in government, or everywhere in the public policy space. The momentum of change that we've found in the financial sector, but also in public policy making, needs to be accelerated, and it needs to be tremendously scaled up if we are to really achieve the fundamental transformation that we're talking about. And all of this has to happen really quickly, because if we don't, we risk continuing investments in unsustainable practices, unsustainable patterns, and then having to deal with that legacy as we move forward. And that will further delay achieving the fundamental transformation we're looking for. In this kind of scaling up, in this acceleration, there are specific challenges, and challenges that face governments and the private sector as well. The most important of those challenges, I think, is the absolute imperative of redirecting investment away from unsustainable uses and into the kinds of sustainable investments that will enable the transformation. That is what it is all about in many terms. Now, in order to do this, we have to make the green more attractive than the brown. We first have to start by preventing harmful behavior. We have to do no harm. And by insisting upon that, we are forcing ourselves to think about alternatives that are both practical and sustainable. But all of this means that we're going to be dealing with markets in the future that are fundamentally different. We're going to have to come to terms with a market that by 2050 is going to have 9 billion people in it. Because it's going to be a global market. We have 9 billion people, many of whom will be reaching a degree of prosperity that will allow them to become consumers for the first time. Again, that's something Chris alluded to in his presentation. These are consumers with multiple needs. And it'll be in a world that is undergoing real stress from managing the dwindling resources that the planet will offer us, and at the same time is undergoing rapid and deep technological transformation. Again, one of the things you talked about, Chris. Now, this is going to be a very, very tough market for business to operate in. But it is also going to be a really big market for business to operate in. And most importantly of all, it's going to be the only market that business is going to be operating in. So you have to learn to deal with it. And business, investors, the private sector, can choose to engage with that market today and shape it for sustainability, or they can find themselves having to engage with that market later, but not being able to set the terms of that engagement. And I think that that is a clear choice that we will have today, but that we won't have tomorrow. So to achieve all of that, I think we will have to significantly scale up our investment in order to green certain sectors, such as infrastructure. We'll need to use the scarce public resources much more effectively. We'll need to step up our efforts to create the enabling policy and regulatory environment for sustainable private investment. And we will have to develop a new financing paradigm in which green finance is the norm and no longer a niche. But we have to also come up with a new way of handling the issue of risk. Much of that investment in the brown that I talked about a moment ago happens because it's always happened. It's what we're used to, that kind of investment. We don't undertake anything new in large part because we don't know how to assess the risk. We don't have the established methodologies. We don't know what the likely reaction of the policy environment is going to be. We are not sure of what methodology we should use to identify the risk and to assess it and to bind it into our decision making. So clearly, public policy can play a role in mitigating that risk by setting out a predictable framework of public policy of regulation. Clearly, financial actors will have to identify ways of seizing onto that risk and ways in which they can assess it. And the methodologies used have to be broadly accepted, including by ratings agencies. We will also have to take into account other risks. And it's not just the risk of the investment itself or of the project that we're trying to do, but it's the ancillary risks that are happening around us, the risk of social upheaval that will profoundly affect the way in which any project is evaluated by those who are affected by it. And there are systemic risks, environmental risks, that do affect business outturns, and the insurance sector has learned how to deal with that and is a source of a lot of guidance in how we can handle these sorts of issues. But before I end, I'd like to point to one other real challenge for sustainable development, and that is the need for a common language, something that we can all understand. One of the things that the G20 talked about was the need for clear definitions on what is green. We are in a financial market today that is quite fragmented in terms of, well, definitions, in terms of objectives, in terms of the capacity even to assess what's going on. We need to clarify as a really important priority what we mean when we say something is green or something that is sustainable. You mentioned again how that has changed, that perception has changed over time. And we need to have that clarity of definition in order to be able to measure progress, in order to be able to say what is good, to identify any gaps that we think need to be filled, and to be able to support the innovations that will actually contribute to the kind of transformation we're looking for. In fact, that's one of the issues we discussed this morning at the meeting of the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, the Global Dialogue, which is the question of definition. What are we actually talking about, and how can we agree on what we all mean? This is something that is being looked at within UNEP FI, the UNEP Finance Initiative, by a group of banks and other investors, under the concept of the positive impact. It's a neutral and holistic way to explore the kinds of tools that might be used to assess, to certify, and to qualify the positive impact of financial instruments, and to direct our attention to those that can be used to enhance sustainable development. Whatever the approach is taken, however, we do need to have clear measures of financial flows, because these are key to the implementation of innovation within the industry, key to assessing progress, and key to sending clear signals to the policymakers on what is needed. So in conclusion, most of you here would qualify as market leaders. You're the ones, the pioneers who've innovated, who've decided that this is important, and you change your practices, and through changing your practices, you change the markets. But our capital markets are not yet sustainable, far from it. You have signed up to be responsible investors, and we need you to redirect capital away from the brown into the green, away from the unsustainable into the sustainable. We need you and the changes that you will implement in order to transform business practices and to innovate. We need for sustainable business practices to become standard business practices. It should no longer be acceptable that anybody practices business in a way that is unsustainable from any perspective. And we need for everyone to understand that there is no trade-off between social and environmental concerns on the one hand and good business on the other. In fact, these concerns are a part of good business. The last 10 years have been about raising awareness on financially material sustainability issues. I think the next 10 years will have to be about creating impact and developing business opportunities for sustainable development. And so I'd ask in closing, what should be the end game? What do we think should be the final result of all of your efforts? Well, we would want to reallocate capital away from unsustainable practices toward the investment in people and in technologies and in production methods and in consumption patterns that will make life on this planet sustainable indefinitely. And secondly, in doing this, we'll want to reestablish the link between finance and the real economy, a link that we sadly lost over the past few decades. And the loss of that link in many respects was what is behind the sorts of upheavals that we've experienced in the last decade or so. Is that too much to ask of the financial sector? Is that too much to ask of the responsible investor? I would think, ladies and gentlemen, that it is not. Because I think that that is what the Sustainable Development Agenda is asking of all of us on this planet. And I'd leave that with you as a final consideration, is that you may be the leaders, but we will all end up having to follow you if we want to continue to live in a sustainable way on this planet. Thank you very much.
Elliott, thank you very much. We've got a couple of minutes so we can take some questions. If I can just perhaps ask the first question. You, please, take a seat. You talked about the G20 and the communique that they issued, and you referred to the one thing that, well, one of the things that they also referred to when it came to green financing. The official communique talks about a whole range of challenges, and it does say that a lack of clarity in green definitions and a maturity mismatch are two of the challenges. To be fair, they're probably the only two that I understood, because the rest of it is complete gobbledygook. I don't know about you, but information asymmetry and difficulties in internalizing environmental externalities sort of confuse me a bit. But when you look at all the challenges that green financing faces, progress is being made, but can those challenges, can getting clarity of purpose, getting clarity of purpose, but also getting agreement, common language, common objectives, can it be achieved?
I think yes, I do think it can. I think one of the first steps we have to take is to understand what the challenge is and to agree on how we want to approach the challenge. And if we spend time in groups such as this in discussing what we consider to be the problem and defining how we want to go about it, then we will probably reduce the extent to which we work at cross purposes. And I think that's critically important. When they speak about information asymmetries, well, all of you as investors, you understand how critically important it is to know what you're investing in. It's a matter of having the information that you need to make an informed decision. And in many respects, I think that the move to green finance and much of what you try to achieve through the PRI are addressing exactly that. It is trying to identify what kind of information do you need in order to be able to make the right kind of choice. And in many respects, what we're talking about when we talk about green finance is choosing to make investments in things that are sustainable by understanding what is not sustainable. And that then refers back to the question, the strange jargon on internalizing the externalities. It is, in many respects, we have been able to get away with not having to bear the full cost of what we invest in, what we produce, and what we consume. As any economist will tell you, price is really important in making a choice. And if the price contains all of the costs of a given activity or of a given product, then it allows for a properly informed decision. a properly informed choice. And the externalities question has been exactly the source of the problem that we've had, that we've been able to avoid some of the costs of our activities simply because we've not been required to include them in the price. And so when the G20 talks about all of these challenges, they may seem insurmountable, but if you take each one individually, you'll find that there is already progress underway, and that through fora such as these and through the efforts of those concerned with sustainability, we will be able to make the changes that are necessary to achieve everything that the green finance approach is setting out. But it does require quite a bit of work, and it does require a joined-up effort, not just the private sector, not just the private finance, but also the public policymakers and other stakeholders as well.
And of course, time is of the essence. We have a question from the floor. We've got some roving microphones, so if you just pop your hand up if you've got a question. I've got a feeling, Elliott, everyone's got an eye on a drink. No, we've got one just down here. Could we get a microphone to him? Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. One of the things that puzzles me is that while we all accept tremendous interdependence in the investment, in the environment benefits that we produce, in the SDGs, there's also an interdependence between inequality, governance, sustainability, and so on. How can we move ahead with the environmental issues if we can't get a handle on governance, inequality, and all the big policy issues that the SDGs also contain?
I don't have a simple answer to that. If I did, I'd probably be running for president somewhere.
Not in the US.
My child has quite a bit to say about that US election. But one of the things I think we should look at is how can we address some of the social concerns that you mentioned through environmental policy or through economic policy? How can we deal with some of our environmental problems through a shift in the way we do social policy or the way we do economic policy? How can we get to a better economic outcome by taking into account some of the social objectives that we might have and the environmental imperatives that we have to live with? In other words, what I'm arguing for is an integrated approach. It should never be that any policymaker makes a decision on a particular piece of policy without asking what are the inward and the outward spillovers. In other words, how will my policy decision affect somebody else's policy in some other sector, and how will the actions and the activities in other sectors affect what I'm trying to achieve in my sector? The moment we start thinking that way, we have to take into account other concerns, and we end up choosing a policy that may not be, in our own expert opinion, the single best policy in our particular area, but it is a policy that does no harm elsewhere. And I think to the extent that we move into this integrated approach of first doing no harm and then trying to mutually support agreed objectives across a whole range of issues, we'll find ourselves able, I think, to respond to some of these challenges. How do we deal with environmental concerns while still preserving job growth? How do we reduce inequality without directing through some sort of a, I don't know, I hate to use the word with any sort of negative connotation, without some sort of a central planning approach. Let's put it that way, as perhaps the least objectionable way. I think in many respects the outcomes that we have are the result of focusing far too narrowly on trying to get economic growth without looking at what kind of economic growth or at what cost, on trying to achieve a social outcome without looking at how we will sustain the payment for those social outcomes if we don't have the right kind of economic performance. So integration, I think, that's the challenge, but that is the only possible solution going forward.
Please join me in thanking very much Elliott Harris for his insights. Thank you so much.